For certain stories, the first time experiencing them have an entirely different feel than any other viewing. Those tales with the big reveal, whether that be a unique twist or an intentional misdirection or some surprising detective work that has to be explained at the end. Those reveals for which spoiler tags are held in high regard, and which can't be forgotten enough to ever have that first viewing experience again. On repeat encounters with the story, we catch all of the clues. Even if we guess the reveal before it happened the first time, the task of putting the hints together is something we can only do when we haven't yet had the reveal given to us. For every other time we witness the tale, the most we can do is realize the few clues that we missed the first time around. And those clues are all obvious now. That momentary lingering on a tiny object is a blaring siren to us now, instead of just an easily dismissed eccentricity of the storyteller. That adjustment by one person during the investigation was actually a sign of their lies rather than a sign of their discomfort. And that very early clue, when we didn't even know enough about the story to realize it was meant to forecast the reveal, leaves us shaking our heads asking, how could I have missed that? When it comes to the lives of we followers of Jesus, there's a similar question asked concerning the work of God after we've gone through desperate times. How could I have missed His guiding hand in that difficult moment? How could I have not seen God's provision when I felt like everything was lost? How could I not have realized that this seemingly insignificant detail in my life story made a huge difference when I was ready to give up? Usually we think about God's miracles in big ways. A huge check that covers our mounting debts right down to the cent. A brand new job that fits everything we could ever have hoped for, and it even pays double our old salary. Some benefactor steps in and gives us the car that we needed at just the right moment. But often, God's presence and provision in our times of desperate distress come to us in the small things, in the tiny clues and offhand remarks. Those details we miss while we're going through the story for the first time because we have to live it. But once we've had time for hindsight, after we've experienced the big reveal of God's work in our lives, then those blessings of God are obvious. Sometimes so blatant that we ask how we could have not seen this while we were going through the difficulty to begin with. Why did I feel so desperate when God's hand was so obvious? In this sermon from 1 Samuel 21:1 to 22:5, in our series entitled A Song of Failures and Hope, we're going to see David experience desperate times. He's on the run from Saul, who wants him dead. And while David knows that he's been anointed by God to be the next king of Israel, that life seems so far from true. He's alone, or at least close enough to alone, and a fugitive from the state. The army he commanded, gone. The stately home of the king's son-in-law, back under surveillance. And the home he grew up in, probably soon to be torched by the crazed king. He has nothing, and any of the few allies he might have can do little in the face of the difficulties that he's experiencing. David's in desperate times, and he does what every desperate person does. He tries out anything that might give him the slightest handhold so that he might be able to stand up against the troubles facing him. But in the midst of it all, even in the flailing missteps, God's providing presence is right there, at every turn. We who know the end of King David's story are able to witness the tiny clues and hints of God's providing presence without much trouble. But when we're in similar situations as David, it's difficult to see that truth. The first hint in our passage is very blatant, considering how God's presence is literally mentioned by the very provision. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 to 6. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, Why are you alone, and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has charged me with a matter, and said to me, Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, Truly, women have been kept from us as always when I go out on expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of presence, which is removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. David's running for his life, and maybe the tears from the parting with his closest friend have finally stopped flowing. And in his desperation, David runs to the tabernacle, the place where God was to be found among those seeking him. It's a good first impression for David. Run to God. But we can see the direness of the situation as he talks to Ahimelech the priest. Even Ahimelech could see that something was wrong. I mean, one of the generals of Israel's army runs to town without anyone else, and he's heading straight toward the tabernacle. This is why the priest approaches, with his own fear on display. Again, we hear the desperation in David's words. He can't tell the truth to the priest, but he needs food. So David fabricates a story about Saul sending him on a secret mission. Something requiring secrecy, yet David is telling the priest all about it. And something requiring haste, hence his need for food. But not so much haste because he has had time to plan a secret rendezvous with his men? It's a flimsy story, full of holes in logic. But to someone in desperate times, it made enough sense to hold. And possibly David was also trying to give his present helpers some sort of plausible deniability, if it should ever get out that they helped him. I personally feel like Ahimelech saw through the ruse, but understood enough to see that the rising star of hope in Israel was suddenly on Saul's hit list. And he wanted to help David regardless of the terrible lie. I can't be certain that this is what happened, but regardless, the priest still gave in to the fugitive's request. However, there was a stipulation to the provision. See, there wasn't any regular bread, only the special holy bread, called the showbread, or the bread of presence, the bread that sat on a special table in the tabernacle, and that represented the providing presence of God in the midst of his people. No matter what was going on with his people, those 12 loaves of bread were right there. The bread of life found right where God said it could be found. A tiny hint of God's presence for any Israelite who might come to the tabernacle in their moment of desperation. We followers of Jesus have our own bread of presence found in the true bread of life, our Savior. And though his place is on a throne at the right hand of God instead of on a table, we can be even more sure that he will be right there, in good times and in the bad times, even in our own desperate times. The stipulation that Ahimelech gives to David is that whoever eats the bread must be holy. Basically, they need to be in a clean state when eating it. This uncleanness would most easily be made by the men having sex with their wives. Not that sex is a bad thing, when performed in God's boundaries for marriage. But God does say in his law that one who has had sex with their spouse must be purified before partaking of anything holy unto God. At this stipulation, David almost laughs. Yeah, the men who eat this bread are in a state of being set apart for God's purpose, and they've been kept from their wives. That always happens whenever the army goes off on a mission. 3 thoughts occur at this moment. First, didn't David say that this was a surprise mission that he was to go on? How could he have had time to prepare like that, but still need food because they didn't have time to prepare? Another one of those inconsistencies of the story. Second, did David have men with him at the moment? Or was he alone? I mean, he definitely came to Ahimelech alone, the priest says as much. But were there a handful of men waiting for David to return with the food? Men who had indeed kept separated from their wives while on this fugitive's run with David? Or was he actually alone? It makes sense that he was the only man on the run, considering the circumstances. But when Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 to 8, refers to this event, he speaks of men with David. So I have to believe that at least some retainers were with the general in this early stage of his flight. And speaking of Jesus' reference to this event, leads us to our third thought about this giving of the bread of presence to David. How could David take and eat bread that was meant to be eaten by the priests alone? At the very least, we have to interpret the event the way that Jesus interprets it. In the Matthew passage, we see the context of the Pharisees fervently blaming Jesus' disciples for being unlawful, because they picked grain from the field on the Sabbath day when they were hungry. In the face of the accusation, Jesus uses this moment from David's life as one illustration of the fact that God prefers mercy over sacrifice. People who live out the mercy and holiness of God instead of strictly adhering to the letter of the law in order to lay blame at the feet of others. While it was technically outside of Pharisaical teachings for David and his men to eat the bread of presence, Ahimelech lived out the mercy and holiness of God by providing God's presence to David in a desperate time. It's not really any different than another of Jesus' illustrations in Matthew 12. The law speaks of no work being done on the Sabbath, yet the priests still performed sacrifices, something no one could deny would technically be work, and they performed them on the Sabbath. God never faults them for that, because those priests are still doing what God commanded, even if some strict adherence to the interpretation of the law would blame them for working. So we can truly see that in our 1 Samuel passage, Ahimelech is doing the work of God by giving David the bread of God's presence. The priest is being that provision from God to David. It's not perfect, and is really messy for us to understand. But at the very least, we can see that in the midst of this desperate time, God's presence is found. His provision literally offered while David was in a dire time. But just because God's presence might be freely given to us, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go right for us from then on. We'll still need further provision. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 7 and 9. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, Then have you here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, The sword of Goliath the Philistine whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, There is none like that. Give it to me. Suddenly a sinister person enters the stage, Doeg the Edomite. He was one of Saul's lackeys. Likely his title of chief herdsman wasn't literal, as if he was the shepherd over a bunch of actual sheep. Rather, this would be a colorful description of his actual role, like one who watched over a part of the flock of Israel, as a spy of sorts. At the very least, this is what he's acting like in the passage. Doeg was in Nob for some reason. At least that's what it seems like to us. And that reason detained him just long enough for him and David to see each other. Or should I say, like verse 7 actually points out, that God detained the spy. Yes, the plan of God includes those who would set themselves against his plan. His provision doesn't mean that there will be no enemies for us. It just means that he will provide us the means to overcome them, which is exactly what God provides David. Still in the tabernacle with Ahimelech, David realizes that he also doesn't have a weapon, so he asks if the priests would have one. And the only weapon around was the sword of Goliath, the means of God's presence in this situation to overcome the enemies of God's plan had already been provided in an act from years ago. It might have seemed like a small thing to take Goliath's mighty sword back in chapter 17. Just a trophy, a trinket to be donated as a symbol of God's victory. But now, it's a reminder of why David was the kind of man that God chose to be human king over Israel. David would not see God mocked. None could defy the Lord God of Israel and live. And this includes a crazed king who seems so much bigger than a normal problem of life. But then again, Goliath had seemed pretty big before, and God was still with David then. God's presence seen in a reminder through a sword won amidst a previous desperate moment. God's presence is with us, and can be witnessed in the many previous situations when we have been in desperate times before. The hints in this situation found from earlier big reveals, also that God can use those moments to build us up and ready us to face the new enemies of God's plan. It's amazing when we think about it, how many times the situations that we've been in before give us help in this present moment. Those lies defeated, those sins overcome, those difficulties that we have overcome because of God's word, because of his people, because of his presence, over and over again. We see the hints of God's provision in the now through those moments. And with that idea in mind, David takes up the sword of Goliath, and he says that there are none like it. This provision from God is unique, not only because the sword was made for a giant, but also because it was uniquely capable of reminding David about God's previous moment of presence. That thing he needed right in that moment of desperation. And maybe it makes David think of a possible plan. Could God be sending me to the Philistines? Might an ex-general of their enemy's army look like a prize for their purpose? Something that David could use to find an ally? And so he heads to Gath, one of the Philistines' 5 main cities, and he discovers that while missteps can happen in crazy and desperate times, yet still God provides. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 10 to 15. And David rose and fled that day from Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? With the sword of Goliath in hand, David goes to Goliath's hometown of Gath. Maybe some of us could see that this wasn't quite the smartest move to make, But when we're in desperate times, we'll grasp for anything. And like I said, David probably sees the Philistines as possible allies against Saul's murderous attempts. But while David's waiting for his audience with the king, he comes to hear the warnings of the royal court as they speak with Achish. Hey, king, this isn't a good alliance. This David is king of the land. The people of Israel love him more than their own actual king. He's only using you for his own purposes to aid you in his coup against Saul. And remember, this is the guy who people sing about. He has slain his 10,000s. 10,000 of what, King Achish? Of Philistines, that's what. This guy's done nothing but kill our people. You know what that means. He'll turn on us the second that he takes over Israel, because that's the kind of thing that we would do if we were in his place. And so with this failed attempt at alliance ahead of him, David finds himself in another desperate situation. He's being held in custody by the enemies of Israel. Just when he thought he had a way to fight the enemies of God's plan, he found himself in another enemy's clutches. God's presence was needed all the more. Some might wonder where God's presence is in the midst of this part of the story. The passage seems to make it look like David's quick thinking of making himself look like a madman imposter got him out of this one. There's no God part in that, is there? But there are 2 psalms that David wrote concerning this event, and they give us David's cry for God's providing presence. We see it the most clearly in Psalm 34, verses 18 and 19. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them. What was that right there at the beginning of verse 18? The Lord is near the brokenhearted? God's presence is near us in our desperation, in our many troubles, and in the midst of our difficulties. God provides. It's a clue that David does actually see when he writes the psalm concerning this moment. And whether he sees it while still in Philistine custody, or later on when thinking over the whole situation, one thing is clear. God's presence was right there with him, listening. Just as it is when we are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit, in our own desperate times. For David, God's presence was with him in the idea of what to do. Few Philistines who faced David have lived to give a description of his face. And before certain technological advances, it wasn't too difficult to pretend to be someone you weren't. So David pretends to be a madman who believes himself to be David. Possibly he hoped that having the giant sword would prove to be a believable enough reason for a madman to pretend to be the giant slayer. The door scratching and drooling probably didn't hurt either. So when David was brought before Achish, his eyes almost rolled out of his head. Come on, guys. You think this is David? This obvious lunatic? You're just as crazy as he is if you think that this is actually David. And that proves that I have enough madmen around me, so I don't need more. And he sends the supposed pseudo-David away. And David hastily runs from Philistine lands, right into a cave in Israel. And there he discovers a fledgling army, which included some of his family. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 to 5. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and mother stay with you, till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab. And they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart, go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. David came to this cave, alone or with a handful of men already with him, and he desperately waited for God to move. He didn't know what to do. He had tried to gain allies in the Philistines, but that was a waste. There was no moves left for him to make, nothing that he could think of. And I see David sighing in prayer, asking what he was supposed to do. Please, God, tell me. Things didn't look the way that he thought that they would, and desperation bit into his fraying edges. But then, an echoing footfall overpowered his pleas, and when he went to go check, it was his brothers, with his mom and his dad. Likely the story they told him was of Saul oppressing the family as revenge against David. And since they couldn't stand against the king, they had come to their little brother's side. Remember, several of David's brothers had followed after Saul for a long time. They'd fought for Saul, even while making fun of their baby bro. But now, desperation drew them to God's chosen king. But the footfalls and couple of new add-ons to David's entourage didn't end with them. No, ally after ally dripped in. other fugitives who were falsely claimed to be enemies of the state, debtors who couldn't stand during Saul's incessant governmental needs, political dissidents who could see that God was no longer with their king. In bitterness of soul they came, alone, in pairs, small groups. Little by little, God provides the allies David would need for the next step of the plan, all the way until 400 warriors and their families burst out from the caves. Desperate people who needed a leader, one already provided for them by God, his chosen king. But David's aging father Jesse, along with his mother, couldn't continue on with the mobile guerrilla army that their son led. Something needed to change, and this is where another of God's hidden hints of provision kicks in. Israel had other enemies besides the Philistines, enemies who might be willing to aid, if not ally, with David, enemies who had a relation to David because of another desperate time. See, David's great-grandmother was a Moabitess. The book of Ruth is named after her. If not for the desperate situation of famine in Israel, Ruth would never have married Naomi's sons. She never would have even met them, for it was that famine that led Naomi and her family to Moab to begin with. And if not for the premature deaths of Naomi's husband and her 2 sons, Ruth would have never followed her mother-in-law back to Israel. And Ruth would have never married Boaz. And their son Obed would never have been born, which means that Jesse would have never been born, and thus David would never have been born. David's family's existence came about because of God's presence in the midst of desperate times. It's a clue to a reveal of provision from long ago, but it remains a hint of God's presence in David's life. If you doubt that the connection was meant to be seen in the passage, I'm going to point out the fact that in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 2, the verse just before Moab is mentioned, the people who collect around David are said to be bitter of soul. The word for bitter is used less than 50 times in the Bible, one of which is when Naomi tells the people of Bethlehem to call her Mara, which means bitter, because of the bitterness of her situation. If it weren't meant to see the familial connection to Ruth here in 1 Samuel chapter 22, then God wouldn't have had the human author place the word for bitter so close to the mentioning of Moab being the place of safety in the midst of a desperate situation. God's providing a hint for provision that he gave a long time ago, generations before David was even born, let alone anointed as his king. And that provision was exactly what was needed for David. The king of Moab found an ally who was related to his own nation as well. And all he had to do was harbor the families of David's men and provide for David's parents. The son of Jesse gave his father a place at a king's table. With peace of mind concerning his parents, David returned to the caves of Israel, caves that acted like a stronghold. Collecting more and more of the bitter dissidents of Israel, David waited for knowledge of what to do. And then one last provision came, in the form of the prophet Gad, one of the people who likely continued writing the book of Samuel after the aging prophet died. This addition of a prophet meant big things. One, this was a direct voice from God. A true prophet was needed by a king of God's people to hear the direction of God. And 2, ever since Samuel left him, Saul had been without a prophet, other than himself when those prophetic fits that spoke against himself came. So David would have a voice of God when Saul had none. And 3, having a legitimate prophet with David would give credence to God being with the rising king, instead of the old one, who had failed him and rejected him. The prophet Gad was God's provision in human form, proof that God was with David, visible for all to see. He has a prophet with him, a true prophet. And what was the word that God gave to his provided prophet? It's time to move, David. Let's go. The time has come for you to take on the king who rejected me. You are no longer a desperate fugitive without allies. You're now a leader of an army loyal to you, and more importantly, loyal to the God whom you serve. Stand up, David. Your desperate times are over, though the difficulties are just beginning. And let's start with the land of Judah. Though we passed through months, if not longer, of David's life, we saw a desperate fugitive flee a king, be provided food and tools to overcome his enemies, make a misstep, but still find God's presence near, and become a leader of bitter people in their own desperation, all to be shown that God had long provided the provision for them in his presence. We can be sure that even in desperate times, God's presence can be found. This doesn't mean that we'll never have any more trouble, or that everything will be resolved in our favor. I mean, this is just the beginning of David's time evading Saul. Years will pass in his life before the resolution of being made king of Israel comes to pass. And even that won't mean the end of conflict for him. We have to stop believing that God's presence means complete resolution and no more problems. Life isn't a story with a neatly wrapped up ending. We don't have a detective character to tell us every piece of the puzzle. But that doesn't mean that hints of God's presence can't be found as we remember the provision of God from previous times of desperation. And, if we look closely enough, we can witness the hidden clues of His presence in our current ones. This perspective isn't easy. Trust me, I felt like such a hypocrite when I sat down to write this sermon. I feel like a hypocrite right now, speaking the words. I believed, and still believe, that even in desperate times, God's presence can be found. But I didn't feel that when I wrote these words. Still don't really truly feel it as I speak them. But just because I don't feel it, doesn't mean that it's not true. The truth of God remains, despite how I am feeling in the moment, despite how you're feeling in the moment. That's the beauty of God's presence in our desperation. He's still there, whether we see the clues or miss it in the moment. And that provision will lead us to the next part of our lives, whether that be continued desperation or some sort of resolution. No one can promise us to have good times and easy lives, but there is still a promise that stands true. God is with His people to bring restoration to the humble. So, if you're in desperate times but have yet to bow before the cross of Jesus, find your resolution in Him, His death, His burial, and His resurrection, God's provision freely given long ago for us. If you're in desperate times, as one who's already begun this journey of following Jesus, which includes me, then let's also find our resolution in Jesus. His grace, His mercy, His church gathered around us. God's provision in those easily missed hints of His presence. And if you're not currently in desperate times, praise God. And also, be willing to be the presence of God in the lives of His people who are feeling desperate, with the hope that they will return the favor when your own desperation comes to pass. Cling to the God who is present, despite how we feel in these desperate times.